I still remember the coldness of the water, not the temperature, though that too was like ice against my skin, but the coldness of knowing that the hands pushing my wheelchair toward the edge of the dock belonged to people I had raised, people I had loved more than my own breath. My name is Margaret Holloway, and I am 78 years old now, though some days I feel ancient as the mountains and other days I feel like that young girl who once believed family was everything, that blood was a bond nothing could sever. How wrong I was. How painfully, devastatingly wrong. It begins, as all stories do, long before the terrible moment that changes everything. I was born in 1947 to a modest family in Oregon, where the rain fell like whispered secrets and the forests grew so thick you could disappear into them and never be found. My father worked in the lumber mills, and my mother took in sewing, and we were poor in the way that makes you rich in other things: closeness, resilience, the kind of love that doesn't need words. I married young, at 19, to a man named Thomas Holloway who had eyes the color of cedar bark and hands that could build anything. He was a carpenter by trade but an artist by nature, and when he looked at me, I felt like I was the only woman who had ever existed in the world. We had 3 children: Daniel, my firstborn, serious and watchful even as a baby; Rebecca, my wild-hearted daughter who laughed like music; and James, my youngest, my gentle soul who collected stones and told me stories about where they had traveled before they found their way to him. Thomas and I built our life slowly, carefully, like one of his furniture pieces, sanded smooth, fitted together with patience and precision. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy, and that seemed like enough. He would come home smelling of sawdust and pine, and I would have dinner waiting, and the children would tumble around our feet like puppies, and in those moments I thought I understood what heaven must be like. Simple. Warm. Full of the people you love. But life, I learned, is not a straight line. It curves and breaks and sometimes it shatters completely. When Thomas was 46, a logging accident took him from us. One moment he was there, solid and real, the man I had built my entire existence around, and the next he was gone, leaving behind only his tools and the echo of his laughter in the walls of our home. I thought I would die from the grief. I thought my heart would simply stop beating because how could it continue without him? But I had 3 children who needed me, and so I did what women have done since the beginning of time: I survived. I took the small insurance payout and Thomas's savings and I invested it, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. I discovered I had a mind for business, for seeing opportunities where others saw only risk. I started small, buying a duplex and renting it out, then another property, then a small apartment building. Over the years, through careful planning and relentless work and perhaps a bit of luck, I built something substantial. By the time I was 60, I owned 17 properties across Oregon and Northern California, and my modest inheritance had grown into an estate worth just over $11 million. I was proud of what I had built, not for the money itself, but for what it represented: proof that I had honored Thomas's memory, that I had protected our children, that I had taken the broken pieces of our life and created something whole. I imagined leaving it all to Daniel, Rebecca, and James, seeing them secure, knowing their children and grandchildren would be cared for. I imagined family dinners where everyone gathered, where the love I felt for them would be reflected back to me like sunlight on water. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. My children grew into adults I barely recognized. Daniel became a real estate developer who spoke in numbers and percentages, who looked at people like they were transactions to be completed. Rebecca married a man named Gerald who had cold eyes and colder ambitions, and she slowly transformed into someone who measured love in dollar amounts. Only James seemed untouched by greed, but James had always been different. He became a social worker, married a kind woman named Elena, and they lived simply, teaching their 2 children that happiness couldn't be purchased. The distance between us grew like a shadow lengthening at sunset. Daniel would visit, but I could see him calculating, appraising, mentally dividing up my assets. Rebecca and Gerald would come for holidays, but their conversations always circled back to my properties, my investments, my plans for the estate. They would ask, casually, too casually, whether I had updated my will, whether I had considered selling some properties, whether I needed help managing my affairs. I wasn't a fool. I saw what was happening. But I kept hoping that underneath the greed, somewhere deep down, the children I had raised still existed. I kept hoping that love would win. Then, 5 years ago, I had a stroke. It was massive, devastating, and it left me partially paralyzed on my left side and confined to a wheelchair. In an instant, I went from an independent woman who walked 3 miles every morning to someone who needed assistance with the most basic tasks. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but some days I wasn't sure luck was the right word. Daniel moved me into his home, a sprawling modern house on the coast that felt more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. He and his wife Catherine insisted they wanted to care for me, but I could feel the weight of their expectation, the impatience that hummed beneath their solicitous smiles. Rebecca and Gerald visited often, too often, always bringing papers for me to sign, always suggesting that I should make things easier on everyone by transferring assets now, avoiding estate taxes, simplifying the trust. They used words like responsible and practical and sensible, but what I heard underneath was hurry up and die so we can have what's ours. James was the only one who came without an agenda. He would sit with me for hours, reading aloud or simply holding my hand, and in those moments I could breathe. He and Elena had refused any financial help from me over the years, insisting they wanted to make their own way, and I respected that even as it broke my heart a little. They were the only ones who seemed to love me for myself, not for what I could give them. And perhaps that's why I decided to change my will. I didn't tell anyone, but I went to my attorney, a woman I had worked with for 30 years who came to Daniel's house to meet with me privately, and I restructured everything. James would inherit 70% of the estate. Daniel and Rebecca would each receive 15%. It felt fair to me. James was the only one who had remained true, who had loved without conditions. And I thought, perhaps naively, that it would all work out, that after I was gone they would accept my decision and move forward. But somehow, they found out. I still don't know how. Maybe they bribed someone at the law firm, maybe they found paperwork I had hidden poorly, maybe they simply guessed. But about 6 months ago, the atmosphere in Daniel's house changed. The pretense of care evaporated. They stopped being careful around me, stopped moderating their conversations. I heard them late at night, Daniel and Catherine, Rebecca and Gerald, discussing options, discussing problems, discussing me like I was an obstacle to be removed. At first I thought I was being paranoid, that the stroke had damaged my mind as well as my body, but then I started noticing other things. My medications would be slightly off, pills missing or dosages that seemed wrong. I would feel suddenly drowsy after meals, disoriented, confused in ways that frightened me. I tried to tell James, but he lived 2 hours away and I couldn't reach him easily. Daniel had taken my phone, saying I was too confused to use it properly, that I kept making calls and forgetting about them. The day it happened was in early October, the kind of crystalline autumn afternoon that makes you believe the world is beautiful and orderly. Daniel suggested we go to the lake house, one of my properties about an hour north, a cabin on a private lake where Thomas and I used to take the children when they were small. He said the fresh air would do me good, that we could have a family day, just the 4 of us, him and Catherine, Rebecca, and Gerald. James wasn't invited, which should have been my first warning, but I was so desperate for connection, so hungry for any scrap of the family I remembered, that I agreed. We drove in 2 cars, and the whole way Daniel kept up a cheerful monologue about memories, about how much I had always loved that lake, about how peaceful it was there. When we arrived, the lake was mirror smooth, reflecting the gold and crimson trees like a painting, and for a moment I felt something like happiness. Daniel wheeled me down to the dock, that long wooden pier that stretched out over the water, and the others followed. We sat there for a while, making small talk, and I remember thinking how strange it was that no one was really looking at me, that their eyes kept sliding away like I was already gone. Then Daniel said he needed to get something from the car, and Catherine went with him, and Rebecca said she needed to use the bathroom, and Gerald said he would help her find the key, and suddenly I was alone on the dock in my wheelchair, looking out at that perfect mirror of water, and I heard footsteps behind me. Fast footsteps. Running footsteps. I started to turn, but hands grabbed the handles of my wheelchair, and before I could scream, before I could understand what was happening, I was moving, rolling forward, faster and faster, and then the dock ended and I was airborne for one terrible suspended moment, and then I hit the water. The cold was shocking, absolute, driving the air from my lungs. The wheelchair was heavy, pulling me down, and my paralyzed left side was useless, dead weight dragging me toward the bottom. I tried to scream but only succeeded in swallowing water, and I could hear voices above me, muffled and distant, and I realized with perfect clarity that they were not calling for help. They were leaving. I was going to drown here, in this lake where I had once taught my children to swim, and they would tell everyone it was an accident, that I had rolled too close to the edge, that tragedy had struck, and they would cry at my funeral and inherit everything and no one would ever know. The water closed over my head and I sank into the green darkness, and I thought, this is how it ends. This is how my story finishes, murdered by my own children for money, disappearing into the depths while they watch. But I didn't die. My right arm, still strong from years of wheeling myself around, found the buckle of the wheelchair's seatbelt and released it. My right leg, still functional, kicked against the wheelchair frame and pushed me away from it. I clawed toward the light above me, my lungs screaming, my vision narrowing to a tunnel, and somehow, impossibly, my head broke the surface. I gasped and choked and went under again, but I kept fighting, kept kicking with my one good leg, kept pulling with my one good arm, and I made it to a piling of the dock and clung there, hidden beneath the planks, too terrified to make a sound. Above me, I could hear their voices, closer now, and I held my breath and pressed myself against the piling, praying they wouldn't look down into the shadows beneath the dock. "Do you see her?" That was Rebecca's voice, tight with panic. "No. She went down with the chair. She's gone." Daniel, calm, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "Are you sure? Shouldn't we check?" Catherine, uncertain. "Check what? You want to dive down there? She's paralyzed, she's 78 years old, she's strapped into a wheelchair at the bottom of a lake. She's dead. We call the police, we tell them we stepped away for 5 minutes and when we came back the wheelchair had rolled off the dock, and we're devastated." Gerald, cold and calculating. They stood there for another minute, maybe 2, and then they left, their footsteps receding back toward the house. I stayed frozen beneath that dock, clinging to the piling, for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, until I heard their cars drive away. Then, with the last of my strength, I pulled myself along the pilings to the shore, dragging my useless left side through the water, collapsing finally in the mud and reeds at the lake's edge. I lay there shaking, coughing up water, unable to believe I was alive, unable to process what had just happened. Somehow I made it to the cabin, crawling, pulling myself across the ground like a wounded animal. Inside, I found a phone, an old landline I had kept connected for emergencies, and I called James. I could barely speak through my chattering teeth and shock, but I managed to tell him where I was, that I needed help, that something terrible had happened. He and Elena came immediately, found me wrapped in blankets on the cabin floor, hypothermic and traumatized, and they took me to the hospital. The doctors said it was a miracle I had survived, that someone in my condition shouldn't have been able to escape a submerged wheelchair, that I must have a powerful will to live. But it wasn't will, exactly. It was rage. Pure, crystalline rage at what my own children had tried to do to me. James wanted to call the police immediately, but I stopped him. I had a better idea. I had spent my entire life building something of value, and I knew exactly how to dismantle it in a way that would hurt them most. I called my attorney from the hospital and I changed my will again. Daniel and Rebecca were completely removed, they would receive nothing, not a single dollar, not a single property. Everything would go to James, to Elena, to their children, and to a foundation I established in Thomas's name to help families who had lost parents to workplace accidents. Then I had my attorney draft something else, a letter, detailing exactly what had happened at the lake, witnessed and notarized, to be opened in the event of my death. I had the wheelchair recovered from the bottom of the lake and stored as evidence. And then I disappeared. James helped me. We told the hospital I was checking out against medical advice, and he and Elena took me to a friend's house in Washington, somewhere Daniel and Rebecca would never think to look. I recovered there slowly, regaining some strength, and I waited. I waited for Daniel and Rebecca to realize I wasn't dead, that I hadn't drowned, that somehow I had survived. I waited for them to panic, to wonder what I knew, what I had seen, what I would do. And I watched, through James, as they began to unravel. They called constantly, demanding to know where I was, insisting they had been so worried when I vanished from the lake, claiming it had been a terrible accident, that the wheelchair must have had a faulty brake. They hired investigators to find me. They contested the new will before I had even died, claiming I was mentally incompetent. But my attorney had decades of documentation proving my sharp mind, and the letter I had written was clear and detailed and damning. 2 weeks ago, I finally emerged from hiding. I came back to Oregon and I held a press conference, with James and Elena beside me, and I told my story. Every word of it. The whole world learned that Daniel Holloway and Rebecca Garrett had pushed their disabled mother in her wheelchair into a lake and left her to drown for an inheritance. The video went viral, an old woman in a wheelchair, hands shaking but voice steady, describing the coldness of the water and the coldness of her children's hearts. The district attorney opened an investigation. Both Daniel and Rebecca were arrested, along with their spouses, and charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. Their lawyers are calling it a misunderstanding, an accident misinterpreted by a confused elderly woman, but the evidence tells a different story: the recovered wheelchair with no mechanical failure, the timeline of their departure, their panicked phone calls in the days after, and most damning, security footage from a neighbor's camera that captured the sound of the wheelchair rolling down the dock and the subsequent conversation above the water, everything I remembered hearing in those terrible moments beneath the dock. I sit here now in James's home, truly safe for the first time in years, and I look at my granddaughters playing in the yard, and I think about justice and mercy and whether I have become as cold as the children who tried to kill me. I still love Daniel and Rebecca. That's the terrible truth of motherhood, that love doesn't simply evaporate even when it should. I love the children they were, the babies I nursed and the toddlers who called for me in the night and the young people who once looked at me with something other than calculation in their eyes. But I also know that who they became is a choice they made, and that they would have let me die without a moment's hesitation, and that if I had drowned that day they would have stood at my funeral and cried crocodile tears and spent my money and never lost a night's sleep. Sometimes I wake from nightmares where I'm still sinking, where the water closes over me and I can't fight my way back to the surface, and James finds me crying in the dark, mourning not my own near death but the death of the family I thought I had, the death of the dream that love could overcome everything. Money, I learned, doesn't just reveal character, sometimes it erases it completely, replacing everything human with something hollow and grasping and ultimately empty. My children wanted $11 million more than they wanted me, and now they will spend years in prison with nothing, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to understand how we arrived at this ending, how the story that began with so much love and promise turned into a thriller where the victims and villains share the same blood. The truth did rise back to the surface, just like I did, gasping and shocked and forever changed, and I suppose that's its own kind of justice, but it's a cold comfort on the nights when I remember teaching Rebecca to swim in that same lake, her small hand in mine, trusting me completely to keep her safe from the water that would someday become my own grave, or would have, if I hadn't been stronger than they believed, if I hadn't loved myself just enough to fight my way back to the light.